Hello, and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a series of conversations that we record both with audio and video and then put on the internet about the topic of designing better miniature games. My name's Mike. I design some miniature games such as Gaslands, a game about pushing toy cars around, and A Billion Suns, a game about pushing little spaceships around. And this is my good friend Glenn, who also designs games. And we are both obsessed with rolling dice because that's a thing that we've done a lot of in our life. And sometimes, very occasionally, we come across a game where you don't roll dice in order to play a tabletop miniature games, and you don't see very many of them. And Glenn encountered one of them recently, and we thought we'd just have a bit of a chew on what the place of chance and randomness is in these games of which we make. And maybe just explore some of the options and maybe muse on where some of the space that hasn't maybe been explored enough is. And I'm definitely going to make a reference to a dartboard later on.
So, yeah. So there's sort of two sorts of things that I want to try and box out here. There's uncertainty, which can come from a bunch of different things in a game. And then there's one of the forms of uncertainty, luck, random number generation, stochastic uncertainty.
Is that uncertainty between players, or is that uncertainty in one's own mind about how something's going to turn out?
So I think this is the question. Is uncertainty necessary? So a lot of, there is at least one entire book about the idea that uncertainty is necessary for a game, and that's as in not being sure how the game is going to turn out before you start playing it. I'm not 100% sure that uncertainty is necessary for a game. I'm not sure how much uncertainty is necessary for a game. I do wonder how much you can have a game which is a narrative game that has like an instantiated sort of narrative. So
I feel like a thing without uncertainty is just like, it's like a movie or a book. It's like a repeated. My instinct, having not read that book that you're referencing, is that probably uncertainty is definitionally required, but I'm not sure.
I mean, I don't
maybe
know.
We'll solve it in the next 20 minutes.
I've got a whole shelf of game books, of fighting fantasy game books, and they're instantiated games. The pages don't change however many times I read them. I reread them, and I reread them knowing what the outcome is going to be, and maybe following the exact same path I followed last time, and they still feel like games.
But you have to roll a d6 occasionally, though, don't you?
Some of them you do. You don't have to in the choose your own adventure games. They have no dice whatsoever.
I've never done one of those. All right.
And personally, as with a lot of people, I don't roll the dice when I play a fighting fantasy game because I have no interest in just.
Oh, you're coming at me for cheating at Ark of Horror, the card game, and there you are, not even rolling your luck rolls in. Goodness me.
I assume the dice come out average because you aren't made to take a path with too much damage, and so I take an averaged amount of damage from each encounter in order.
That's a third of a hit point for me and a third of a hit point for me.
I mean, that's how I happen to play the game. But the point is, there are game books that have no dice and have no chance. And they still feel like they are games. There's a game called Time Stories that, yes, I mean,
right, and there's a ton of video games that do have chance, and there's a ton of video games that don't have chance, and rely on your own performance.
Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective is not just a game; it's a Spiel des Jahres winning game, and there's no chance in that whatsoever, not a dice or a card to be flipped. So there do seem to be games that don't have like uncertainty. Can you replay Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective? I've replayed Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective.
Only if you forget things.
Or if you just enjoy the process of going through it. That's the thing, is the joy I get from rereading.
But that's that conversation that we had 6 or 8 months ago about, like, is it a process or is it a game?
Yeah.
Like, you know,
So
we were playing Ticket to Ride over Christmas, and I commented that there was literally no interaction between the players. We may as well have been in different countries playing two different games of Ticket to Ride. For all that it mattered, we were at the same table. And my wife was like, well, I just like flipping the cards and putting the trains down. And it's like, well, I do as well. This is fine. All right, let's carry on.
My brother-in-law is very cruel and very interactive Ticket to Ride player.
Oh, he's one of those, yeah.
And
he probably plays Carcassonne like a bellend as well.
you can troll the hell out of people on Ticket to Ride.
Oh, is there a single train that you needed to go there?
He plays Ticket to Ride to see if he can break somebody. By the end of it, by you figuring out which routes they need and intentionally just screwing with them and not caring that neither of them are going to win. But there's a debate, and it's not the debate for today, as to whether uncertainty is a necessity. I'm not sure. I feel like it probably is. It's probably safe to assume it is, because most games do need it, and it will be safer if you put it in your game. The question is, where does your uncertainty come from?
Right.
And
right.
what ways can we generate it, and what ways are interesting? And so,
that's partly it. It's like, as soon as you have a game that has more than one player, you have uncertainty because you don't know what that other human is going to do. They might put the one train down in the one route that you need, despite the fact that it disadvantages them just because they're an absolute pain in the bottom.
Yes. I think that the general sort of opinion is that there are 5 main forms of uncertainty, or at least my opinion is that there are 5 main forms of uncertainty that you can have in a game.
Wait, get it into print so it can be the official one. All right. I'm going to write this down. I'm going to put them as a pentagram, okay?
Stochastic uncertainty, which is your dice rolling, your card flipping, your luck.
That's stats to you and me.
Social uncertainty, which is I'm not sure what the other guy is going to do, and that's where we might have things like hidden information. I secretly pick something, and you have to guess what it is. Procedural uncertainty, which is something that's very rare in physical games, but you get it in like legacy games, but digital games do it all the time, where it's like, I don't know what's going to happen when I press this button. The same thing will happen every time I press this button, but until I press it, I can't find out what. And so, like when I do something in Pandemic Legacy, I don't know what the result is going to be of my doing it, and then I find out a new rule has been unleashed, so the procedure changes for me.
All right.
Performative uncertainty, which is like what you get in sports, but yeah, playing darts, shoving pucks around. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get the ball into the basket or hit the bullseye or land the puck in the right place. And lastly,
and why don't you call that skill?
I mean, you could call it skill, but people call it performative uncertainty because
it's a much longer word.
What is uncertain is whether or not you can perform the thing.
Not whether you have the skill, which you may or may not.
You presumably,
in the moment.
Presumably your skill is a constant. Your ability to perform the action is not. And the 5th one is complexity. Uncertainty due to complexity, which is what we see in, say, chess or Go or something of that nature, which don't necessarily have any of those other things, but certainly we're uncertain of how the game is going to pan out when we start it. And a certain amount of this conversation is about that last one. So a game that got brought up in the Discord, and I had sort of heard mentioned previously in relation to this point, is I think it's called The Woods, or In the Woods. And it's a tabletop miniatures game that generates its uncertainty via a little bit of social uncertainty, but primarily uncertainty due to complexity. It requires a lot of like moving parts to come together in order to sort of generate what's going to happen. It's difficult to predict what's going ahead. And there's a video on YouTube of the chap explaining that in real life, sometimes you don't know what the outcome of something is, not because of random chance, not because of hidden information, but just because the world is a complicated place and lots of stuff is going on, and he wanted to try and recreate that, which is a laudable idea. The question is like, okay, which of these forms of uncertainty are a good idea? What do they bring to these sorts of games? What ones may be a weird or peculiar idea? I think we all know stochastic uncertainty. We know how that works. We've talked at some length about dice and card mechanics. Personally, I find social uncertainty very interesting. At the tabletop, particularly, I like bluffing mechanics. There's a lovely the combat resolution system in Freebooter's Fate is particularly nice. You get cards that have body parts on them, and you pick as many cards as like the skill level of your character to attack, and the opponent does it to defend. And each card the attacker picked that the defender didn't pick is a hit, and more than a certain number is a critical hit, which is this lovely little bit of back and forth bluffing and social uncertainty that I think works really well. Procedural uncertainty, I'm not sure how open it is to these sorts of games. We've spoken a few times about performative uncertainty. I love some performative uncertainty. It's hard in miniatures games, I think, because we're kind of precious about our miniatures, and we don't want things being flicked around and thrown about and dropped and bounced around. But I do think there's a window for it. And
I think it's actually something that, like, in my research back into the 70s, I've encountered way more than I was anticipating. So, and I've been researching naval games just out of curiosity for Pacific Command, but like, there's an early naval game where you have to build a specific stick and you have to put a tack in it, but it has to be off center, and then you have a template and you have to pin the tail on the donkey in order to shoot a thing. And that's like, it's a bit like the Man of War sort of location system, but with a literal stabbing motion. And P. Grant, my chap that I've been reading over the Christmas season, he talks about the first ever war game he played was bombers are attacking a carrier, and in order to eliminate the bombers, you have to throw darts at a dartboard and hit the right physical location of where the bomber is. And so it was entirely dependent on your actual skill at darts about whether you could nail the incoming vessels. And also there's that amazing game Caveman on War Games Vault, where you have to screw up bits of paper and throw them across the table, and you've got to hit the opposing caveman miniature with your ball of rolled up paper, which is like a stone throw, in order to strike a shooting hit.
And I think the thing is, I think the reason that we so often return to stochastic uncertainty there is chaos is fair. If I put a dice roll into my game, I know exactly how uncertain it is and how uncertain it will be for all of time for all players. If I put performative uncertainty into it, if I put this thing where you have to throw darts at a dartboard, at some point, some players are going to become more expert than other players at that. Somebody's going to play against somebody who's already a very good darts player, and now I don't have uncertainty in my game, and I don't know at what rate the uncertainty is going to leak out of my game, and I don't know how it's going to sort of come between people. If my intention is not for it to be uncertainty, there are plenty of fantastic dexterity games that are meant to be about like learning to do the thing and finding the knack and getting the way of doing it. But if we actually want it to be not just a mini game that you're meant to get better at, but to be the equivalent of rolling dice and to be a genuine generator of pure uncertainty, then that's one of the big problems, I think, for every other form of uncertainty. And
I think that's why I like describing those as skill mechanics, is that, like, you can get better at understanding and mitigating luck, but you can't eliminate it. You can genuinely get better at, like a fighting beat 'em up game computer game. Like you can genuinely get exceptionally high levels of skill in that by understanding, the interaction of the physical movements and the response on the screen. And in a skill-based game, like there should theoretically be a way where two people who are very good at the game could come together in a competitive environment and have a thrilling match where, their physical or dexterity based skill at some kind of manipulation of the game pieces meant that you had a wonderful, sort of miniature game experience. But I just don't know that there is one.
Yeah, and I think it's like I say, it depends on what your intention for.
Actually, there is one, Glenn. It's Sabutio, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, absolutely, Sabutio
Because
is.
I often forget about that. Like that was one of my earliest miniature war game experiences. It just happened to be football. Like there was a lot going on with Sabutio that like echoes the things that I still love today. I don't think it was my first like little tiny people game, but like
I couldn't get over the simultaneous play, like turnless nature of Sabutio. That somebody can just keep flicking if they're fast enough, and that it meant the skill gap was.
I don't remember that. Oh, I'm deeply interested now. I really want to go back and like. Wouldn't it be interesting to try and play like a Viking skirmish game, but just using all of the Sabutio miniatures and just see what happened? It'd be so interesting.
There's absolutely a game in there, but I think that. So I think the thing is that if your intention with these forms of uncertainty is to create fair levels of uncertainty, I really think that stochastic uncertainty is the only option. If your intention is to make it so that the outcome of the game isn't 100% certain, and you don't mind if it's largely certain one way or the other, that you accept the fact that the certainty will creep into the game. I think you can use those other mechanics, but at that point you're coming to a point of, do you need uncertainty in a game? If you're putting this game together and the uncertainty is a performative or a complexity mechanic, and somebody learns all of the complexity or masters the performative skill, and you therefore have a game that actually doesn't have uncertainty in it, we are back to that question of, is uncertainty an actual necessity? What sort of uncertainty, what sort of level is required? Is it just the order in which things happen or the time at which they occur? Or does it have to be genuinely unsure as to who's going to come out ahead?
Before we realize that that's the key question, I suppose I am still interested about this fifth option that you put, because I'm not sure I grok what complexity is in terms of uncertainty, like, or rather how I would set about making a miniature game where complexity is the thing. Clearly I'm going to go and read In the Woods and figure out what they're doing, but like how does one approach complexity as, okay, I'm going to eliminate dice and I'm going to introduce complexity? Does one just have lots of rules? Do I have lots of elements of the process of resolving an action? Like,
yeah, so I believe that the way that they do it in the Woods is they have sort of overlapping stats that create the various modifiers, and they overlap in a way that is relatively intuitive to get to pay out once you've learned the little sequence, but to predict ahead of time what the combination of stats is going to be between the two models is very hard to sort of grasp and wrap your head around without spending an excessive amount of time examining it. I mean, what it is, it's like you say, it's like if you're playing chess, right? Even without the sort of, I don't know what the other person is going to do, chess grandmasters do know what the other person is going to do, because they go, well, you would only do that. Anything other than that is just dumb. You'll do that, then you'll do that, then you'll do that, then you'll do that. But the game is still uncertain because of the sheer level of complexity that seeing far enough ahead and holding all of those, automatic choices in your head are. For the rest of us, we can get that level of uncertainty at a much more basic level. Essentially, if I ask you to look at a combat between two miniatures And to figure out who is going to win requires you to have 3 different numbers in your head, add them together, run them through a conversion table, and then do the same with the other miniature and compare them together and see which number is higher. You're not going to be able to do that stood at the table, whilst playing, and that's how these games try and generate uncertainty through complexity, within a miniatures game. Whether that's a good thing, and whether you get to a point where, I'm going to memorize all of the tables and all of the stats, and actually I think I might be able to do it on the fly, at the tabletop, and the complexity drains away, is the question as to whether or not it's a good form of generating uncertainty.
Because I'm interested in this, because the one time that I've seriously tried to make this work was with Hobgoblin, where I said, well, right, normally you roll 10 dice. Let's say you roll a dozen dice, and they're D6s, and let's say they roll 1 through 6 twice, so you know exactly the results that you get. Like, you can automatically calculate the results of any combat, and there's no surprises. Like, is there enough interest in the movement and the sort of choosing of combats to say, well, without the uncertainty of whether the dice slightly spike in one direction or another, is there enough to have a game there? And so I think that's interesting, because my system was deliberately simplistic, and so combats were, in that chanceless situation, utterly transparent, and so I could pick the combats and know exactly what was going to happen in this theoretical version of Hobgoblin. Whereas with something like chess, like, I make a single move, a vast number of possible moves then open up. But yeah, exactly how do you execute that? And I'm thinking about regimental games right now, and maybe it's much more difficult in that situation. But like, if I'm thinking about, a skirmish game, or even I'm zooming into a particular, like a saga level kind of battle, like, the possible movement that each individual combatant could make could maybe be interesting enough that there's enough uncertainty. But then, I worry at that point, like, one of the things that chess does is it makes that incredibly fast to execute. I think the tendency, as I'm thinking about how I would approach this, would be to introduce things which just are tedious to resolve. There's jumping, and there's bouncing off walls, and there's skidding through people's legs, and there's a bunch of stuff that is exciting and cinematic in theory, but is irritating to execute without a grid-based board.
I think the thing that's super tough about complexity-based uncertainty in tabletop games is the line between enough complexity that it is non-calculable for not just the average player, but a repeat player who's very interested in the game.
Right.
And the line of complexity, which means that players have zero understanding. A player who has zero understanding has zero interest. You've lost somebody if they just have no idea what's going on, and
you see that all the time with, like, Euro games, when you introduce them to your family and they're just like, what is this? No.
And one of the things that's great about rolling a dice is that I can say, you roll a dice and add +1, I roll a dice and I don't add anything, and we both immediately know, we understand what the odds of one of us winning versus the odds of the other one winning, whether it's a likely good idea for you or for me to attack or whatever else, whilst being completely uncertain as to which of us will actually win that outcome. If I achieve the same thing with complexity, I have to put you into a state where you actually don't understand who's going to win the combat in a more sort of problematically nebulous way, I think, anyway. And certainly you've got to find this state where somebody who is good at holding a lot of numbers in their head and a lot of states in their head is as confused as to the outcome of a combat as somebody who isn't good at those things. And that is a really, I think, hard thing to pin. I know people who have very different skill sets within that area, and the same bubble that could catch both of those people, I don't.
Well, I also think there's a really strong tension between what war games are trying to do, which is give you a simulation of reality which feels like it behaves like it's supposed to, and the places where complexity, like the two canonical examples you gave, chess and Go, like incredibly abstract, utterly abstract. Like the reason that you don't know what is possible with a bishop is that bishops can move in other directions when they're humans. Like they can't only move in diagonals. Like that's nonsense. But like, I think the place that you would introduce complexity, the place that I'm seeing complexity being able to be introduced would naturally go along with some sort of abstraction that would be at a strong tension with, well, I know how fast boats go in the 1940s because they had engines with this speed and they go this far, and it's like there's no uncertainty and complexity there. They just go that far. And I think maybe you end up relying on, and I don't know whether this is what In the Woods does, but maybe you end up relying more on the cinema and the narrative, and less, pushing very much away from there is realism here, pushing towards abstraction, pushing towards kind of emulation of narrative and drama rather than trying to model and simulate.
I know, yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting concept, achieving uncertainty via complexity in a tabletop war game. I don't know if it's ice skating uphill. You know what I mean? Where it's like, yeah, maybe you could do it. I'm not sure of the reason to do it. I'm not sure of what the advantages over rolling a dice. Rolling a dice is so easy and so fair and so perpetual and so.
I mean, like there is joy in understanding the systems of something like chess, and there is joy in model making and creating tiny realities. There doesn't seem to me to be any intrinsic reason why those two things shouldn't share a Venn diagram overlap, wherein lies a wonderful game.
Well, I think
I just don't. I mean, maybe there's a cultural reason, maybe there's a player-based reason, but like logically, there should be an overlap there that's enjoyable. That doesn't have anything to do with dice and anything to do with realism.
I think the issue is, again, it's why it is what you're using your uncertainty for. In chess, the uncertainty in chess is not a tool to resolve the encounter between two chess pieces. The uncertainty of the complexity of chess is the game of chess. And when you resolve that single piece of complexity uncertainty, the game is over. When we roll a dice in a war game, the rolling of the dice is not the game. The rolling of the dice is a piece of resolution within the game, which we are then trying to resolve. And this is the thing about like throwing a dice to resolve a combat, or resolving a sort of intentionally complex and difficult to calculate set of numbers to resolve a combat to hide the uncertainty. And that is that the point of the game isn't that resolution. I'm not trying to make you good at playing darts. I would like you to continue to throw darts in an unskilled manner. I'm not trying to teach you to break through the complexity of the resolution structure. I want you to not look at the table. I want you to intentionally not memorize that table, please. That would ruin the game.
Yeah.
And that's what's tricky, where it's like, well, I'm sorry, I've memorized the table. I looked at it 5 times. I've memorized it now. I can't help it. I've got that kind of a brain. I'm stuck with it in my head. And now whenever I think of the combat, a number poops out. There we go. We're done now. The complexity is just dead. I can't help it, and the complexity isn't the game. Breaking the complexity ruins the game. Breaking the complexity in chess doesn't ruin chess. It makes it great. Breaking the complexity in a game that's relying on complexity for its uncertainty kills the game. And I think that's the difference, and that's the issue, and that's the problem with it. And that's why we keep going back to dice, is because they're kind of unbreakable. I
That's right.
can't.
And like, I mean, to draw this back to a thing that I'm sort of working on slowly in the background, like my primary design challenge that I've given myself for Pacific Command is um in the Pacific War in World War II, like the position and disposition and composition of forces in the Great Wild Ocean was the main thing that people were uncertain about. Like you could know what they had built potentially back at home base, but you didn't know what they'd launched and where it was. And so I'm really interested in this question of uncertainty because I'm trying to build a double blind fog of war mechanic. And I could use stochastic methods. I could use social methods. Like I could use performative methods, maybe where you have to flip a tiddlywink in, and if you land on the if you land on the aircraft carrier, you're allowed to shoot it, but not until you've landed a tiddlywink on it. Or I could go with complexity, and I don't know what the complexity would look like. I don't know what that complexity option would look like. I understand what stochastic option would look like with cards or dice. I understand a bluffing mechanic for a double blind fog of war. Like that's probably where I'm going to mostly end up. But like I just don't grok what building this out of the word complexity would look like. It's super intriguing to me.
Well, I'll drop you some links to some movies of the designer of the Woods. I will drop you. I'll try and find a link for you to a thread on Board Game Geek called "I almost finished designing a submarine war game after 2,748 hours," which is a guy designing a double blind system for ships and submarines like battling each other, and he's done it with basically he's built a three-dimensional computer out of but it's an interesting process because we should probably have a conversation about double blind because an elegant
give me a couple of months. I'm gonna give you the place that I'm at in a couple of months with my double blind.
An elegant double blind tabletop game thing, I think, is one of the holy grails of tabletop game design.
Right, which is why like given the challenge of make a naval game fun, which is, let's face it, people, the challenge in itself. Like I've added to that, like make it double blind because that's what World War II Pacific War theater was like. So yeah.
There's a few acres of snow. I know that's I think that has a double blind system or something close to a double blind system. But anyway, this is another conversation, another topic for another time.
It is indeed.
That was a conversation about some forms of uncertainty. It was a bit of a conversation about complexity generating uncertainty. I'm not quite certain what that conversation was about. It was so uncertain.
I'm still uncertain about how to create uncertainty from complexity. I'm going to go and read some more games, I think.
But you know, if you've played The Woods, let us know what you think of it. There's another complexity-based game that author has designed, and I will pop up a picture of it on screen.
And if you are a phenomenal Subbuteo player, tell us whether that is actually a place that miniature games have been languishing.
Yes, tell us about what forms of uncertainty you think are a good idea. Tell us what you think about double blind systems, and if you've played a good tabletop game with a good, elegant double blind system in it, because they're a pig. And
I remember this. You mentioned A Few Acres of Snow a couple of months ago, and I tried to buy a copy of it, and it's like 90 quid or something.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. It's been out of print for a while, and it's a holy grail game. So I think I have a hard time picking it up.
I did find a Subbuteo streaker on eBay whilst we were talking though, so that's all right.
Well, there you go. You're all sorted now. You're well set. Drop us some comments in the comments section. Please like and subscribe. Tell somebody you know to also like and subscribe, and tell somebody you don't know in the middle of the street to like and subscribe, because it's good to spread the joy.
Everyone needs to know more about designing tabletop miniature games.
Absolutely, they do. They need to know about double blind systems and uncertainty. I'm certain they need to know about uncertainty. Hit us up on social media. Drop us some comments and thoughts and feelings in the Discord. But for now, and from this episode of Rule of Carnage, it's going to be a thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.